workshop of Elias Thorne didn't hum. It breathed. It was a rhythmic, wooden respiration of 1,000 gears clicking in staggered unison. Elias was a man of precision. He believed that time was not a river, but a series of locking teeth. If a second escaped, it was because a craftsman had been lazy. Lately, however, the seconds were doing more than escaping. They were bleeding. The commission? It began with the grandfather clock in the corner, a nameless commission delivered in a shroud of black velvet. It had no face, only a pendulum that swung with a heavy, wet thud. The client had left a single instruction: make it beat. Elias spent nights hunched over its brass guts. He polished the escapements until they shone like bone, but the clock remained silent. Frustrated, he began to work later, fueled by black coffee and a growing obsession. He didn't notice that his own pulse was slowing to match the rhythm of his tools. The synchronization. By the 7th night, the workshop had changed. The other clocks, the cuckoos, the chronometers, the delicate pocket watches had stopped ticking. They were waiting. Elias reached into the dark cavity of the faceless clock to adjust the mainspring. As his fingers brushed the metal, the pendulum swung. It didn't hit the wood with a click. It hit with a thump shiver. Thump shiver. Elias pulled his hand back, but his skin felt cold. He looked at his wrist. His veins weren't blue anymore. They were starting to take on the dull, burnished hue of copper. When he breathed out, he heard the faint whir of a cooling fan. The final gear. Panic surged, but his movements were jerky, governed by internal ratchets. He tried to scream, but his jaw locked into a preset notch. He watched in the mirror as a small brass keyhole opened just beneath his collarbone. The faceless clock finally began to chime. It wasn't a bell. It was the sound of a heavy door locking. Elias realized then that the client hadn't bought a clock. They had ordered a housing. As his vision flickered and turned to a series of still frames, he felt a cold hand reach into his chest, wind the key in his collarbone and whisper, "Perfect. You're finally on time. Now, if you walk past Thorne's shop at midnight, you won't hear a single tick. You'll only hear the steady, mechanical heartbeat of a man who became his own masterpiece." The velvet shroud was no longer needed. The client, a man whose coat seemed tailored from the very shadows of the alleyway, stepped into the workshop. He didn't use a key. The door simply surrendered to his presence. The shop was silent, save for the one. The inspection. The client ignored the rows of frozen watches and the dust gathering on the workbench. He walked straight to the center of the room, where the tall, wooden casing stood. It was no longer faceless. A glass pane now protected a dial made of polished bone, and the hands were long, thin fingers of silver. "Is he settled?" the client whispered. The clock didn't chime. Instead, the wood of the casing groaned, a sound like a stifled intake of breath. The pendulum swung with a heavy, organic thud. Behind the glass, the silver hands twitched, pointing to midnight with agonizing precision. The transaction. The client reached out a gloved hand and pressed it against the warm wood. He could feel the vibration of gears grinding against ribs, the frantic whirring of a heart that had been taught to count instead of feel. "You were always so worried about the lost seconds, Elias," the client murmured, his voice like dry parchment. "I've simply given you an eternity to find them. No more breaks, no more sleep, just the glorious, infinite now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal, the final scrap of Elias Thorne's soul trapped in a brass casing. He dropped it into a velvet pouch filled with hundreds of other clicking, screaming trinkets. The departure, with a strength that defied his frail frame, the client hoisted the heavy clock onto his back. As he turned to leave, the silver hands of the clock scratched frantically against the inside of the glass, leaving thin, white streaks. The client didn't flinch. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the empty, dead workshop. "Precision is a lonely virtue, Master Thorne," he said, stepping out into the fog. "But don't worry. You'll have plenty of company in the hallway of my manor." As the client walked away, the rhythmic thumping of the clock began to sync with his footsteps, echoing through the empty street until both were gone. The transition from the workshop to the manor was not a journey. It was a rhythmic torture of jolts and darkness. Inside the casing, Elias was no longer a man. He was a nervous system of copper wire stretched tight across iron struts. The hallway of echoes. When the shroud was finally lifted, Elias's silver finger hands twitched against the glass. He wasn't in a room. He was in a corridor that seemed to stretch into a mathematical impossibility. The walls were lined with them, hundreds of clocks. Some were grandfather clocks like him. Others were small, pulsating mantelpieces, and some were grotesque, wall-mounted things framed in skin-grafted leather. As the client placed Elias against the wall, the room began to scream. It wasn't a vocal scream, but a cacophony of unsynchronized time. Hundreds of trapped hearts were beating at different intervals, creating a wall of sound that felt like teeth grinding against his skull. The view from the dial. Elias's new eyes, two jeweled bearings on the clock face, struggled to focus. He looked at the clock directly across from him. Through its glass, he saw a pair of human eyes, wide and bloodshot, darting frantically behind a set of brass Roman numerals. The neighbor's pendulum wasn't made of metal. It was a severed tongue encased in resin, swinging back and forth, hitting the sides of the wood with a wet, rhythmic slap. Then, the client leaned in close. His face filled Elias's entire field of vision. Up close, the man had no pores, no scent, only the faint smell of machine oil and old blood. "Listen closely, Elias," the client hissed. "In this house, we don't keep time. We consume it. The feast." The client pulled a heavy, rusted lever on the wall. Suddenly, the floor of the hallway began to tilt. The hundreds of clocks began to tick faster. Elias felt his internal gears spin until they glowed red hot. He felt his memory being shredded. Every second that passed was a piece of his life being ground into dust to power the manor. He remembered his mother's face. Click. It was gone. He remembered the smell of rain. Whir. Gone. He looked down the line and saw the oldest clocks. They were no longer screaming. They were empty wooden husks, their gears rusted solid, their souls fully drained. They stood like coffins, waiting to be replaced. Elias tried to stop his pendulum, to die, to break, to do anything but count. But he couldn't. His silver finger hands moved forward, marking the theft of his own existence. Thump, shiver, thump, shiver. The client began to laugh, a sound like a clock spring snapping as he walked toward the next delivery. Elias was a hollow shell, but a master craftsman never forgets his trade. He knew that even the most complex machine has a breaking point, a frequency where the metal fatigues and the glass shatters. He began to calculate. The message in the metal, years passed in a blur of mechanical hunger. The client brought in a new victim, a young apprentice girl with wide, terrified eyes. She was being measured for a mahogany case just a few feet away from Elias. Elias couldn't speak, but he could desynchronize. He began to fight the internal governor. He forced his pendulum to skip. He dragged his silver finger hands against the bone dial, creating a jarring, screeching Morse code of friction. STOPHIM, KILLTHEGEARS. The apprentice girl froze. She heard it. She looked at Elias, seeing the wet, human eyes behind the Roman numerals. She saw his silver hands pointing not at the time, but at the main lever the client used to drain them. The overdrive. The client noticed the stutter. He turned, his shadow elongating like spilled ink. "Defective," he hissed, reaching for his winding key to force Elias back into submission. "I shall have to strip you for parts." But Elias had been saving a secret. He hadn't been counting the seconds, he had been tensioning them. For decades, he had wound his own mainspring tighter than any metal should allow. He had become a coiled serpent of pure kinetic energy. As the client's hand touched the glass, Elias let go. He bypassed every safety ratchet, every gear stop, and every governor in his body. He released a century of stored tension in a single, violent millisecond. The bang. The explosion wasn't of fire, but of shrapnel and time. Elias's wooden casing didn't just break, it detonated. The bone dial disintegrated into white dust. The brass gears, spinning at impossible speeds, became jagged saws that screamed through the air. The client didn't even have time to scream. The silver finger hands, propelled by the massive mainspring, flew like arrows, pinning the shadow man to the wall through his throat and chest. Then came the chain reaction. The shockwave hit the other clocks. The tension in the hallway snapped. Hundreds of mainsprings uncoiled at once. The air became a storm of flying glass, jagged brass teeth, and heavy iron weights. The manor's foundation, built on the stolen time of 1,000 souls, began to fold in on itself as the now caught up with the then. In the center of the wreckage, the apprentice girl stood unhurt, shielded by the debris of Elias's case. As the dust settled, she looked down at the floor. There, among the splinters, lay a single, tiny gear. It gave one final peaceful tick, and then, for the first time in an eternity, everything went silent.